So 50 years of a diplomatic relations should be a cause for celebration. Instead, EU-China relations are tense, to say the least. Do they get worse, or is there a way around this?
It's hard, frankly, to see how they can get worse, but they've been getting worse. Even if every year we thought that was kind of the turning point, but there is no turning point, because by now, and although Europe will not phrase it this way, at least not officially, but Europe does see China as a threat to not only to its security, and this is, of course, related to Ukraine, which was very present in the summit, but also to its prosperity. And this is all about Europe losing market share globally, and also in its own market because of China's massive entry in the European single market. Whether it's through subsidies or competitiveness is hard to tell. But of course, the consequence is that the trade deficit, bilateral trade deficit, is very large, and Europe has no deficit with anybody. So the question is, why with China?
Yes. EU's trade deficit with China stood at a record 306 billion euros last year. Alicia, from a trade and commerce standpoint, what do you think Ursula von der Leyen means when she says that EU-China ties are at an inflection point?
Well, frankly, the inflection point has been there in many summits. If you recall the 2022 summit, that was even worse. It was an online summit all about Ukraine, and inflection was mentioned there. So I guess the point is that we have seen a deteriorating relation with inflection points, once for every summit. Last summit in 2023 was all about cross-border data requirements that really were hurting European companies. Now it's all about overcapacity. Has been there for a long time, but this year is about export controls in rare earth. And in the very same way as we heard for the cross-border data, a commission or a working group or something will be created to explore. That's the answer. But, year after year, that answer remains elusive for the Europeans. So that's why the inflection point, if you want, is just a reflection of not getting enough out of these summits from the European perspective.
It wasn't always like this, though, was it, Alicia? So when you look in recent history, the EU, during President Trump's first term in office, shared more of a consensus with China on tackling the trade challenges from the United States. Fast forward 8 years later, the EU and the US, they have a trade deal. The Europeans see what they think is a Chinese overcapacity flooding their markets. Has the EU now simply moved closer into the US, into the transatlantic orbit and away from China? And what then is the off-ramp to all of this?
So it's a great question, and I have a very different answer. It's not about the EU following the US. In fact, the US deal was hardly present, and it could have been, because the EU is very close to that 15% tariff as Japan. But no, it's very simple. The reason is that the EU is no longer benefiting from the relation economically. If you look at the trade deficit that you just mentioned, 300 billion, before was hardly any deficit. It was a balanced trade before the pandemic. And what has changed is, first, that China is importing much less. So Chinese imports are stagnant. And most importantly, the European market share in China's imports has actually come down. So it's just not as convenient, if you want, as profitable. This relation is not as profitable for the Europeans. And this is also true for European companies in China. If you look at the European Chamber surveys, actually 2025 is the worst sentiment on record, not even compared with COVID. So that's where we are. That's why you see this kind of turning point.
Alicia, let's take a look at this relationship at a sector level, because the EU trade actions in the past year have targeted China's export of EVs. So that really embodies the cause célèbre, doesn't it, of a Chinese industrial overcapacity. Von der Leyen has said Chinese leadership has started to look into this overcapacity issue. Do you expect any material change on that front?
Well, for EVs and renewables, I do think China is working on this, but mostly because of its own interest, yeah, because this excessive competition is hurting China, and measures are being taken. But that doesn't mean China does not want to export, because it is on the export side of things where companies producing EVs or renewables, for that matter, have a bigger margin. It is in China's market where these companies are basically operating at a loss. So solving the problem and stopping exporting or reducing exports is a very different point. Actually, exports help reduce overcapacity. So although these objectives look aligned, they are not. And the Europeans will figure this out very, very soon.
Alicia, China's rare earth export controls also came up in these discussions, and this has had a material impact on European automotive production lines in May. This continues to be a significant source of friction. Again, did this summit come up short with any substantive agreements?
Well, this is huge leverage for China, whether it's with Europe or the US. And it's very hard to see how China is going to give up on this leverage. China can show interest in using this leverage in its interest in exchange for something else. And that's basically what this mechanism is all about. So I would say that this is still on the hook for European companies, I would argue.
Then China responds with counter duties of its own on European luxury goods such as cognac. So until there is anything approaching a breakthrough in EU-China trade relations, are both sides, Alicia, effectively locked in a retaliatory trade and tariff war of their own? And which respective economy has got most to lose out of this?
Well, first of all, yes, that's where we are. We're in this vicious circle. We had medical devices, first Europe, then China, and we will have more coming from the European side, because there's close to 20 cases open of foreign subsidy investigations or international procurement, like the case of medical devices. So this is going to come, and you're right, there's going to be retaliation from China. Europe is going to come back again. So that's the spiral. Is this good for anybody? For nobody, because China's largest market is still the European Union. So it's also painful for China, for both sides.